you all here, and thank you, all of you, for taking part in a live event and joining me today. One of the big threads which came out of the meetup was, I suppose, that more and more product teams are being given direct, I suppose, responsibility over owning revenue goals. Some, I think, see it as a great step forward in terms of product influence. And I think that came out in our conversation, while others are a little bit worried about that in terms of focus moving too far away from user experience and delight. So, Ollie, I'm going to come to you first. You spoke at the event and throughout our conversation prior to the meetup in terms of thinking like a founder and pressure testing ideas as a mini business, and how you've done that previously with teams in which you've in your opinion, what are the upsides of product teams owning revenue, and is there any dangers or things that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think there's a danger in it. I think it probably boils down to the organization, and I think different organizations are structured differently. In some cases, it might make sense for the product team to own a P&L. Sometimes it won't. I just, from my perspective, it's always a case of product teams think through a commercial lens rather than always thinking through perhaps just a user delight lens or purely technical lens as well. It's actually just understanding what the trade-offs might be. At the end of the day, anything's possible, really, especially in this modern day. So it's a question of what are the trade-offs. Historically, I've tried to, and I think I said this at the meetup, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but just having product teams actually almost like cost up a feature. How much time is this going to take us? What does that roughly translate to in terms of people's time as money? Are there any processing costs, server costs, etc. involved in it? Almost as if you were a contractor, right? And I came to you asking for a new website and you said, okay, it's going to cost you £10,000 or whatever. Taking that approach, because at the end of it, you will have a number of some sort. And it's not that you should say, okay, well, if we don't make £10,000 back, then we're not going to do this. It's not about that necessarily, but it does raise the question. Okay, if we don't think that this particular feature is going to generate this much incremental revenue, then are we sure we want to do this? Okay, let's look at it through a different lens. Are we achieving anything else? It's just about pushing that commercial decision-making mindset to the front of the process rather than it being an afterthought, rather than it being somebody else's job, frankly, to figure out how we make money or anything like that. Actually just making it part of the process in the same way that you would critiquing the design, considering the implementation approach from an engineering perspective, other infrastructure implementation considerations as well. Just incorporating the commercial lens into that sort of process, I think is probably a very powerful thing you can do before you even get into a world of potentially trying to convince your leaders that we as the product team should own the P&L for this, which I think can maybe in an organization that doesn't have that can get quite, that could be quite a controversial decision maybe.
Nice. And I think it generally comes with the more senior you get, or like depending on the business in which you work in, the exposure which you have, I think it becomes more apparent anyway. So I think starting thinking in that way, even earlier on in your career, I think it's that proactivity. Maria and I were chatting about this yesterday in terms of that proactivity of a product manager, really understanding that impact. Maria, you've been nodding away. So what's your take on this, especially from like a CPO perspective? How do you see I suppose product and commercial teams aligning well or clashing?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I agree with everything that I think Ollie, you outlined. And we spoke about productivity. And I think for me, what this also means is quite often product teams, they think about the initial business case, but then they don't necessarily think about go-to-market, or they don't necessarily think about time to build, because it kind of feels like, well, we focused on prioritization, we used our frameworks, commercially, we think it makes sense, let's prioritize it. And then it goes into the black box. And then if at that point, if it gets delayed, it's an engineering problem, or, it's a design problem. If then it launches, but nobody uses it because, the marketing team or somebody else has not used it, well, it's their problem. And I think for me, that probably what differentiates truly great product managers or product teams is people who do have that end-to-end visibility and who do feel some sort of end-to-end ownership. So it's not just kind of, I got it to that point, I've made the right priority call, whatever happens afterwards is not in my remit because it's not my direct responsibility. It's true that as a product manager, you may not be able to impact go-to-market or shape go-to-market, but I think having that, keeping track of that pushing people to think through it, escalating or raising if something is not happening either within the time frame, which skews your ROI, or, the go-to-market is not happening as you would have expected to get the exposure that a feature of the product needs. I do think all of it sits within the remit of a product manager. That's what I would expect from my teams, from myself. And of course, to P&L point, some people believe in it, some people don't believe in it. I think a huge part depends on the organization. Sometimes people are just not comfortable delegating this to the product teams if they've not seen it work well. Sometimes you can have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right? Like, again, a lot of the times, I think unless it's a deeply technical product where a lot of the marketing is embedded in the product, it's also quite difficult because then you have the growth team or marketing team that also feel ownership. And how do you split metrics? How do you split P&L then is a fair question. But I think some sort of like, okay, at least at a minimum, understanding the performance, being able to report on it, being able to intelligently talk to it. Again, I would say this is for me what differentiates great product teams.
Amazing. And Nayab, I mean, you led the panel discussion, so we didn't hear your view on this, but I think you've got quite, I suppose, unique experience in this conversation, having, I suppose, spent time working as a head of product in Dubai, where, like, from my understanding, like, P&L does sit within like product teams. And then obviously being a founder of your own business now, there isn't a commercial team. You are the commercial team. You are every team. So do you have any thoughts to add to the conversation?
I think, first of all, Ollie and Maria made a very right point. It depends on the organization, right? Even in Dubai, when I joined that organization, P&L never used to sit with product team. The biggest repercussion of that was a very simple feature. Marketing wanted to turn on free delivery because it works really well in Asia and those sorts of countries, and probably even in Europe. Now, in a country like Dubai, people are okay paying for delivery. But there wasn't a due diligence or research done on this. So product team just went and implemented it because the stakeholder asked for it. And this is literally the time I'm joining the company and this was happening. I kid you not, because we were responsible for P&L and we did implement the feature, there was a lot of loss the company incurred, because there is a huge operational cost that goes into it. On the face of it, it's a very simple feature to turn it on and off, but back in the background, there's a lot that's happening. And that was a very good case for me to take it in front of the business to say, you know what, this is the reason we need to be responsible for P&L. Because if we had done good vetting beforehand, we could predict it for you. This is how much you're going to lose, and this is how much you could potentially make. And from that point onwards, we kind of made it that every feature, everything that you're building, it needs to have a revenue or a cost associated to it. And I think Maria said something that she has got that expectation from that product team. I made it that. And now I feel like I'm so fortunate that was there as a practice, because now it's helping me build in my own company, right? Because I have to put that hat on. I have to see, what is going to be the CapEx, what's going to be the OpEx. Luckily, I don't have a CapEx because it's not where I have to deal with products. But the whole OpEx element does come into element, and you have to think, because I know I come from that background, I can manage that. Had I had not that exposure as a product person, I think I would have struggled. That is one of the, other than regulations, compliance and licenses, that is one of the biggest struggle for a founder. How do I keep control of cost? What should I prioritize revenue wise without compromising user experience?
Nice. And I think that from chatting with people who came along to the meetup, I think that's something which was, in the question itself, I don't necessarily think it matters too much as to whether you do actually have direct responsibility. It's more around taking that proactivity, as we've said, and actually the value on which it brings in thinking in that way and taking that upon yourself, not just, even if it's not within kind of your responsibilities, how do you start looking at the commercial value of that as well? So let's talk about like the less visible side of product work. So technical execution is those more, I said, hard to measure improvements that make product feel great. Spencer, this was kind of led by you. And you mentioned like how invisible quality, like good engineering, can really break or make an experience. So how do you advocate for that kind of craft when commercial metrics are like front and center?
I like to try to make the case that it's not something invisible, that it is something that's perceptible, and it's something that communicates to users the values of the business. Users do perceive the difference between a product that is of quality and a product that's shaky, every time a kind of frame drops or loading times out, or there's an error that doesn't have a great explanation for the user or something like that, that is actively undermining the product. And it makes the user a lot less confident that you're a business that's trustworthy, that they can transact with. One of the things that we're really lucky to have here at Popsa is that we don't really have to make that case very often. It's kind of a philosophical stance. So, we don't release buggy features, or not knowingly buggy features anyway. We don't release unpolished software. The space it's too competitive, and it's too easy for a user to switch to one of our competitors if we make them wait or confuse them in some way. So we've chosen to pay a bit of a premium in our development time in order to build this up and create a kind of smoother, faster, more confident experience for users. And it's our belief that that's a kind of competitive advantage for us. And we do hear it reflected back in our user reviews. People do talk about the speed of the experience, how well it works. That for us is an indicator that investment in quality is kind of paying off. And then that trust kind of compounds over time. And yeah, I think it's part of what earns us a lot of long-term loyalty in a crowded marketplace where switching is easy and users have really high expectations.
I think what really stands out from the meetup was, I suppose, a question from the audience, which I suppose jarred you a little bit, Spencer, in that the, I suppose, like delightful sounds, when you say kind of delightful, it kind of feels like it's got to be all bells and whistles and like everything's got to be like really fancy and like an explosion kind of thing. Whereas that real like pushback from you is like that's not always the case. And actually, like you said, there is that consistency, that really good like processes and like you said, the real, can't think of the word, but like the real steadiness of the product and how stable it feels.
Yeah, it's the difference between a company that sort of approaches user delight as a kind of afterthought, as a kind of like, a veneer that they place on top, or whether it's something that's deeply embedded into the values of the company in a way.
And in terms of like the idea of judgment and taste, I mean, that can come into it as well. And I think we all spoke about at the meetup how sometimes, even in a world that is ruled by dashboards and data, sometimes it just feels right. And you've all been in meetings where maybe the data isn't telling you to to take this action, but you all know that that's the right thing to do, and you feel like that's is a strong enough pull to make that decision. So how do you develop that product intuition in your teams? Nayab, do you have any advice on this, or does anyone else have any kind of guidance in how you've supported teams to really develop that?
I used to say to my team, take data as your map, right? And your judgment as a compass. If you don't have the compass, map is useless, right? So your judgment needs to guide you whether this is the right thing to build or not, because data can show you, okay, this thing is converting a lot. So because of the conversion funnel, we should take this as a decision, right? But you're the one who's the voice of the customer. You're the one who's got the empathy and the emotional intelligence, whether what the customer is feeling is right or not, and whether it's the right thing to do. And that's where I really used to push a lot for, you should go and speak to the customers. You should put yourself in their shoes to see, okay, yeah, I've got all this data, but I need to have the empathy to understand the customer to be able to take the right decisions, which goes then hand in hand, right? Because looking at the data, of course, you're taking the right decision for the company, but equally seeing what the customer wants will increase your conversion as well. So for me, it was very much hand in hand, but never lose the empathy element, because I do think empathy as a product person takes you quite far, because it helps you understand a customer's needs. And when you understand customers' needs, that's where you're going to add value, right? And when I, as a customer, see value driven to me, it of course converts. That's a no-brainer there.
Can I add to that as well? Because there's something that I think we all felt and discussed and reacted quite viscerally to, that was brought up in the meeting. And it was about, well, it's kind of twofold. One was about frameworks, which I think we've all got opinions on. But then the other was actually, with the advent of AI, suddenly thinking seems to have been removed from our process, and just thinking about a problem, thinking about solutions, thinking about the implications of everything. People are, I think, Spencer, you said it, people are outsourcing their thinking, which I think is a quite a nice way of putting it. And at the end of the day, we've all been hired for a reason, right? We're in our respective roles for a reason. If Spencer had been hired in, why would we want to not hear from Spencer, for example? So that's where I think like the opinion, the judgment, the intuition, especially from the design side, is easy. And I think it applies to all disciplines, right? That personal intuition that you develop professionally over years, you extract information from what you read, from mentors, from your peers, that kind of averages out into something that people should be passionate about how they feel in their opinions. And that, I think, to your question, AD, is that's when that can kick in, is what do you think? You're the person in charge of this. You're the person running this. I want to hear what you think. Don't point me to a graph. Don't point me to this. Like, tell me how you feel about this. And that's how you can get around those moments when you aren't quite sure maybe what to do.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And just to add, something that we also discussed in the meetup was having conviction. Can you really go to someone on the team and be like, hey, are you proud of what you've done? Do you believe in what you've done and what you're putting forward? And I think if the answer is framework, then is it good enough, right? Like, do you actually believe in it? Because if the answer is no, you can tell me all the frameworks, but if you still do not believe in it, I'm not convinced. So I think it's also something that's not necessarily intuitive, because I think as product people, we all groomed to bring data, to bring the customer lens, to bring research, as opposed to opinion, because I think a lot of the times most product people have to work with people that have a lot of opinions, but not necessarily data or research or customer lens. But yet, I think it's like a superpower. If as a product person, you can also bring that lens of, yes, I've done my due diligence, but equally, I'm also convinced, and this is what my firm belief is. I think it makes it so much stronger.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, if you have all the data and you have all the data and all the research, but actually you don't believe in it.
I came up as a graphic designer. That's sort of how I made my way into this role. And when you're studying graphic design, like, so much of your time is spent developing a taste for graphic design, and you're expected as a graphic designer, when you go into a design business, to be somebody who can exercise their taste, because it's highly refined and it's better than the kind of general population's taste. And it's funny that, like, I don't often encounter that many product people, especially young product people who are entering the industry, who have spent time developing a sort of product taste, and saying, these are the kinds of things that I like, and I like when things work like this, and have a bit of a kind of critical vocabulary that they've developed over time for how they talk about the things that they like, and then be able to express that with a kind of passion and care to, their peers or people in their workplace or whatever. I'm always a bit surprised at how rare it is to encounter that.
Do you have any like actionable kind of like takeaways or bits of advice, Spencer, for people who, if you're not seeing that come through, like how do you do that? Any like tips which you can give people?
I'm a really, really big fan of critique as a way of developing a kind of critical vocabulary for stuff. I'm a really, really big fan of spending time with products that you like and really analyzing them, and spending a lot of time deciding why the good feeling that you get from this product is making you feel good, and why the bad feeling that you're getting from that product is making you feel bad, and just building up a bit of a vocabulary around that. It's something that I try to practice with the team here. And again, this is like straight from like art school stuff. This is graphic design stuff. This is how you develop an eye, is by sitting around with people and discussing it and picking it apart and really sort of getting a bit forensic on it. So that would probably be my starting point. But that's, because of what my background is.
It sounds like a good practice for, people to, if you're trying to build upon that culture, to do with their teams as well. Catherine obviously is not with us today. But one thing that Catherine and I spoke about ahead of the meetup and then came out on the meetup was around like pulse position. So can any of you talk about how you help teams to work in that grey area between like measurable impact and qualitative value?
I think I'm trying to frame the answer in a way that's quite helpful. I feel like it takes a kind of leadership voice, I think, to part the waters, because I think otherwise those situations end up being quite cyclical, and people get stuck in this sort of vicious cycle of debating data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. And I do sometimes think it requires someone either in a leadership position or a leader within the team, not necessarily in title, right, to actually just cut through the noise. And I'm a huge fan of Jeff Bezos's like one-way door, two-way door. I don't even know if he came up with that necessarily, but it's one of those moments where you go, okay, if this is a two-way door, we might as well just do it and then find out. Because actually we're not going to get to the answer. We could sit here debating it eternally, but ultimately we're not going to find out until we actually put it out there. And it's a big sort of pro for iterative working as well. It's just put things out little and often in small bite-sized pieces and learn from each release that you do. But I think we sometimes undervalue the need for someone to just cut through the noise and just go, right, let's take a decision and take that ownership and that leadership in those situations.
I mean, Catherine also mentioned that I think from a leadership perspective, I think she's always advocated for the fact that she was going to protect time for her team to actively try new things. And it kind of, I think your kind of answer to that kind of shifts us into like kind of real life tactics and like, so when we know something is kind of right for the user, but it might not especially kind of like move the needle on revenue today. Catherine kind of done a really good job with that in terms of like protecting that time. But like, how do you get buy-in?
I think there was something Catherine said on that evening that stayed with me, and I thought it was kind of beautiful. Not everything valuable is measured, right? So I thought that in itself explained it beautifully, that you kind of have to instill in your teams that some things which might build trust with a customer and might move the needle might not mean it would have a quantitative number to it. So impact cannot be measured by just seeing the numbers. So she said, where you've probably earned a customer's trust, and that could be something fixing that they've complained about, right, would instantly show you more impact and more value in comparison to what you've seen on data side of things and then gone and delivered it, and it probably might never move the needle or even earn a customer's trust.
I think just to provide a very real example of that, a couple of months ago, one of the iOS engineers in the Popsa team flagged quite a nice, elegant mechanism that another very, very popular unnamed app, thankfully in a different industry to ours, was doing. And like holistically, it was a very nice mechanism. It was this feels like a good thing for the customer. And probably it is going to drive certain metrics in the right direction. And so it was very much okay, well, let's try it. Let's do it. And I think within a day, there was a test build. The day later, it was in a release going out to the App Store. And since then, the metrics haven't been wild, but they've been broadly actually very positive. And we know that as a result of this mechanism, we can provide the user with a better experience. And so that was something that very much just kind of spontaneously came out of nowhere. This engineer was literally just on the app. I thought, oh, that's quite nice. We should do that. And that was it. It didn't need to be more than that. There didn't need to be a huge business case. There didn't need to be a whole load of analysis around it. It was just a very immediate, quick, okay, let's try this. And it's all about like fanning the flames and the embers when that does actually happen, when that does bubble up from time to time. Even if you've got quite a top-down, heavy strategic approach to running your product, that's fine. You just have to make space for those moments of like brilliance where you can't really explain why. You can't sit there and do a whole bunch of analysis. You just have to think, is this a good thing or not, and roll with it.
Maria, you I suppose we've touched on this a little bit in terms of getting buy-in as well around conviction as well and really having that belief. Are there any other tips that you would share around getting buy-in and being able to just kind of move through what you really think is right for the product?
I would say, the key probably for me is like going back to conviction, use your judgment. I think that's also something that you probably see more in senior product people, but actually product to me is one of the roles where no matter what level you're at, you could be a junior product manager, associate, doesn't matter. I think you can still practice that leadership judgment because, it is your job to try to focus on the most important things, right? It is your job to think about the best approach. So if you look from that more of a senior executive impact lens, what's going to have the most impact on the business, I think if you use that lens, then you can decide where do you want to fight for allocating time to smaller tweaks or, user delight and where you don't want to do it. I think there are going to be some situations where it's absolutely appropriate and it's the right thing to do and it's a great thing to do and it fosters innovation in the team and it builds the right culture. But there are going to be other times, we spoke about it yesterday, right? I think if the market is tough and like people have ambitious goals, tight timelines, small teams, probably that's not going to be the right time to fight for 20% innovation time because we want to foster the culture of innovation, right? It really much depends on the context, the organization, the stage of the business. So I would say it's not a very helpful answer because it means that, the answer is use your judgment. But I would always encourage, no matter what level you're at, just always think, what is the most important thing for the business right now? The thing that I want to be doing, can I directly link it to what the business needs? Because I think a lot of the times the businesses do need innovation. So if you can link it to that, that's already a selling point. It doesn't have to be a commercial metric. It could just be like, hey, we said we want to innovate in this new vertical. Or we said that we want to build a culture that promotes XYZ. Allocating this time is going to help us do that. I think that's a totally fair justification, but I think you do need to look at it holistically. I think adopting a black and white, it has to be done like this or like that. To me, that's something that I would see in more junior product people, and something that I always encourage everybody to get rid of, that fixed mindset that this has to be done like this.
Yeah, especially in this market. I think we had a really good conversation about that yesterday, is that that ability to really put yourself in the business issues is so important. When you're up against a deadline, compromises have to be made, where do you flex? Now, this question came from Nayab, and we can always rely on Nayab to throw in like a controversial question, because that's it's a difficult one to answer. Are there any kind of areas which you think, any of, I suppose, examples which you can talk us through where you've had to make compromises on design, functionality, or something else, and how do you prioritize and compromise?
I guess if the question is like, when you have a deadline, is it functionality or is it experience? Sometimes it's the deadline, to be clear. Like, I think sometimes it's a bit underrated that the deadline can be there are not that many very, very hard deadlines in this life. Really, deadline's a slightly political construct, and sometimes it's the deadline that gets to be compromised. I personally think that we underrate how often the experience being good is part of the definition of the thing being functional. As in, something can work, but is there any point in it working if nobody's going to use it because it's awful to use? There's not that often been something that we had to release just to get it out there. It has to be released and it has to be used. And if it's not a good experience, then that's part of the definition of it being functional. So I guess it depends a little bit on what the thing is and why you're releasing it. But yeah, the typical scenario is that we're releasing something because we think it will be valuable, useful, and better than what else is out there on the market. And so if that's the reason you're doing it, then I'd argue it's not functional unless the experience is at least as good, if not better, than what the user can get from somewhere else. So yeah, I'm not compromising on the experience in that regard.
You're compromising on the deadline.
I'm compromising on the deadline, yeah.
I have to work with this guy, you realize? I'll give the opposing point of view from previous roles where, it's awful, but so many of these questions, I think the answer can end up being, it depends. But in the case of a small, startup, early stage startup, trying to find product market fit, trying to find their feet, I think that you can get away with compromising on things a lot more than you can as you then progress through to being a scale up, when I think the concept of brand and what people come to expect and quality and all those things play a much larger part. I'm probably talking specifically about digital products here rather than physical products, but I think that there can be a world where one compromises on the final 10% of building something for the sake of getting it out, getting it, in front of customers quickly, learning from it, because you're in that finding your feet mode. You're trying to figure out what isn't working about your idea. So I do think there's a world for compromise on functionality, stability, on all those things, but exclusively when you're trying to find your feet. I think the moment that you've found product market fit, the moment that you feel comfortable, and that's a separate conversation of when that happens and how you can tell. But, I think from that point onwards, you do really need to focus on refining the experience and things working properly and feeling like they work properly, and having an easy solution and having no friction. I always think of Amazon like but ugly, but it works. It just works across the board. Like they've spent a decade, 2 decades on making sure it just works. And things turn up. You click a button and a thing turns up the next day, and that's all they're focused on. So it can also come in different forms, whereas an Apple product or an Apple service, typically doesn't get released to everyone until it is at that 99th, percentile of perfection. So unless it's iOS 26, in which case we're all going to have a lot of fun with that. So yeah, I do think when you're in that slightly earlier stage, compromise can become, a more acceptable thing. But I do agree with Spencer that for something to be done and your definition of done and your acceptance criteria and all those things, that the experience needs to be a part of that, because that's what the consumer and the customer is experiencing. That's what they're going through. And if anything falters, then you're going to start losing customers.
I would also say it really depends on a product, right? Like, what are you building? Because you could say like Amazon, it's one of the probably controversial points. Some people think it's an amazing experience. Some people think it's a horrible digital experience and you could do so much better, right? Like, and you could debate it forever, but the reality is that Amazon is an incredibly valuable company. It works really well for them. So they've not consciously invested in Airbnb style design and design system and, animation, etc. And they don't need to, because I think what they offer, the actual product, the holistic experience, prime delivery, etc., the experience as a whole makes up maybe for the things that they have not built explicitly in their design or their experience. And I don't know if today they would have invested a huge amount in making the site sleek and amazing and beautiful. Would it change anything for them commercially or materially? Don't know. On the flip side, I think if you're thinking about like very saturated fashion market, beauty market, where there is certain expectation and level of experience, or if you talk about like Oli, like you spoke about purely digital product where it's not a physical product, then I think the expectation from the experience is completely different. And even there, like there is a difference. Is it B2C? Is it B2B? Is it the only product on the market that does it? Because maybe if it's the only product on the market that does it, people are going to struggle through it. And again, it's less relevant how beautiful, how amazing something is. It's more important how quick you can get it to market, how quick you can solve that pain point. Whereas if you're talking about, I think, B2C market, D2C market, the expectations are very different. So again, I think it's for product leaders, design leaders to use their judgment and understand, as you said, Oli, the stage of the company, but also who are we as a business and what is our edge? If our edge is experience and design, it's very different from our edge being the quickest delivery on the market. And that's the only thing that we care about the most.
I think it was good to hear everyone's point of view. I love being a devil's advocate. Just the last few bits that I would like to add. I love Spencer's point around deadline. I guess, when I was working in a company, I felt like there was, the deadline was like, literally harsh lines because it was driven by investors, board members, that you need to deliver something at that point. And at those times, of course, we decided, okay, the complex functionalities have to, we have to park it for now so that we meet the deadlines instead of compromising the user experience. Now, being where I am building something of my own, I think I'm very mindful of the deadlines could be soft lines because I'm bootstrapping it. There's no investor, no one's driving me. I should be mindful of that, a user experience shouldn't get compromised. I should build that trust because once I've built that trust, it will stay. But if I lose their trust due to whatever reason, be it functionality, be it user experience, whatever that might be, I wouldn't be able to gain that back. So I'm very mindful of that actually I shouldn't be driven by deadline. I should be more driven that I need to earn that customer's trust. And once I have that, then of course it needs to work forward from that point onwards. So Oli and Maria both made a valid point. It depends on your business. And it also depends on the stage you are. I think to a bigger organization, I would always say deadlines shouldn't be, literally line in the sand that we cannot move because it's not fair on the teams as well, because you then are quite pressurized in that situation to make hard calls. Deadlines are good because then you're definitely working towards a goal. But it should be movable instead of compromising things on like user experience, functionality, cutting down features, because then you're not actually getting out there that is going to win the customer.
Well, I think this final conversation just proves that we've brought together a really good panel with good opposing views, which I like. So the whole intention has been closed on the last question. So to close off the podcast, we always like to, the whole purpose of us building community was to help people to get connected, help people to learn. So we always like to close with a recommendation from each of you. So this could be someone to follow, someone who you've been inspired by in your career, some reading, podcast, something to learn, a meeting to go to. So from each of you, do you have one thing which you can pass on to the people who are listening to help them build connections or help them to learn?
I would say, I'm happy to start. I think for me, two things. One is Lenny's podcast. I think if someone works in product and not listening to it, they should think again. And second, I think if you are transitioning from a smaller company to a larger business, if you want to understand and learn what good looks like, I would also highly recommend Reforge. I think they encompass best in class Silicon Valley principles of how to do things and how to do product. So it's also, I think, if you are maybe a product person at a smaller company, you've not had exposure, you've not worked in the US, so you've not worked in product driven companies, I think it's just a good place to learn what good looks like at scale.
I don't mind going next. I think mine would be the Diary of a CEO. I don't know how many of you follow Steve Bartlett. I absolutely do. And I love the things that you get to learn from so many people out there. I remember once he actually had a guy who used to work previously in FBI and then has got his own business now. And the method they use to actually get people to own up to things. I absolutely love that, because that then we implemented in our product team and we saw amazing results. It was to do with like reward. And I won't go into detail so people can go and see it. But I think that is a huge learning, be it you actually read his book or you watch his podcast. Every time he brings very diverse people on there. And I think for me, it's been a great learning curve. I follow that podcast and I read his book as well. And I do find it really useful. The second recommendation is slight bit off the topic, but it made a huge difference in my life. And I think I would like to recommend, I've forgotten the name of the writer, that's terrible, but it's called Into the Magic Shop. I don't know how many of you believe in it. It is to do with manifestation. But the reason I am recommending that book is because there are often the times we don't believe in ourselves, right? And that book actually teaches you how, if you believe in yourself, you can move mountains. It's all about that shift of the mindset. It is written by a neurosurgeon whose name I've completely forgotten right now, but I'll look it up and I'll put it out there. But I do recommend it because when I was going through this whole tough scenario of taking this leap of faith, whether I want to build my dream, I think that book really helped me. And I do think it would probably help many out there for this same reason, that it is what you believe, what you say does eventually come true, because you do have that sort of power in your words, in your thinking, because when you say it out in the words, your subconscious mind starts reprogramming it. And so yeah, that is a little bit of a kind of out there advice, but that's it from me.
Yeah, well, a lot of what we've spoken about is mindset, belief, that conviction. So I think it's really relevant.
One is there's a product management tool called Linear, which Spencer will find funny me talking about because it's all we've been talking about for the last few weeks at Popsa. But they have a phenomenally high quality video series called Conversations About Quality, where they interview a whole bunch of leaders in product and in software, and they just have 15-20 minute conversations with them about why quality matters. And I think for that sort of side of the argument of quality versus commerciality and everything else, it's a very interesting series of video interviews to watch. So I really, really recommend that. They did a great job producing those. And then the other that's a written sort of recommendation is First Round, which I think is a venture capital firm. They've got a blog called First Round Review. It's brilliant. It's just really, really interesting topics with really interesting people. Very, very long form content. I'm a huge fan of just very long articles rather than these very short, snappy things. Allows you to really get engrossed in the topic. So it's a bit like the Harvard Business Review kind of style of article. Yeah, and it's all free. You can just read it online. So yeah, First Round Review. That's my written recommendation.
I would like to recommend a newsletter called Scope of Work, written by a guy in the States called Spencer Wright. And basically, they're just sort of short essays on kind of the nature of work. He's a kind of maker in the broadest sense of the word. So he's a designer, he's a software guy, he's sometimes carpenter, sometimes builder, sometimes, all sorts, runs a small sort of makerspace in America and kind of thinks hard and writes about the philosophy of making things in the physical world and the sort of impact and reverberations that things can have on people and communities. And I just love the way that he writes, and I love his point of view. So I'd like to recommend his newsletter.
Well, thank you all for your time, honesty and thoughtfulness. To everyone listening, I hope it gave you a little bit more clarity, or at least some solidarity, I suppose, as you wrestle through building products that both hit the numbers and feel meaningful to people that use them. As always, if you've got any thoughts, stories or questions, drop me a note and come to our next In Product event. And if you've loved this episode, please share it with someone else who's craving connection in product too. So thank you all so much. You really, it's so kind of you to give back to all of the community and to myself. Every time I do sessions like this, I learn so much from you. And selfishly, there's so much resource there that I can now go off and look into as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi.